Hooking up the camera today, we're in Exodus chapter 22. I am going to prophesy, I don't usually do this, just a little bit, and predict that maybe we'll get through part of 23 today. But if you're at home, if you're watching online, always welcome to you. But let me just say, don't adjust your sets. It's true. I have set up the camera on the other side of the room just to be impartial. You know, usually somebody said this is my better side for the camera. But I don't know how that's going to affect the lighting, honestly, so we might have to change it back next week. But we are in a part of Exodus called the Book of the Covenant. It is a set of more detailed laws we received the Ten Commandments from on high, and then these get very particular. Just for your kind of understanding where we're headed today, just for your listening enjoyment, today we have oxen, thieves, false witnesses, and a little premarital sex. Just to keep you on your toes, okay? Keep you awake. But I'm gonna just to help you understand where I'm coming from. In these kind of very detailed types of law, it's case law. We could spend a lot of time on these different cases. And so what I'm going to try to do is not go verse by verse, but try to give you some highlights from the different sections as we go in and through this Book of the Covenant. We're on chapter 22, verse 1. When someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep. The thief shall make restitution. One thing you might notice as you look at the sheet that I gave you is that some of the English translations have placed the verses in a different order. So it starts verse 1, and then there's verse 4, and then it goes back to 2 and 3, and it's a little confusing. The King James Version just kept it in order, the verses in numerical order, but they're not in logical order that way. So you might find, I don't want that to trip you up, it's a textual variant, some in English translation, some committees, the translation committees, had decided to try to keep it more in a logical order. But here's what I really, that was for an attempt to organize it better, to better understand it. But here's what I really want to focus on, the thievery or the robbery part. Crimes of theft, often livestock animals, then had fines associated with it. It was a very serious thing. You take away somebody's livestock, you're talking about their livelihood, the ability for a family to feed themselves, so on and so forth. But fines were also the way that most of these laws were actually carried out in the community. So it's not always that they practiced literally how it was defined. Like the lex talionis, as I mentioned this last week, that's the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These might sound harsh, they may not make sense to us in our moral point of view today, but these laws were to set boundaries. So, the idea of an eye for an eye was that I couldn't go and take 2 eyes for one. So that was about human to human type of laws or cases where people hurt one another. In the case of livestock, you could have the thief have to pay more than one. But again, these are all about limits. It's not about, it may sound egregious to us, but it's not about anything but setting a just fee or fine for the type of case that comes before the community. So let me say something about that. It comes before the community. Who does it actually come before? Verses 8 and 9, if you skip down and look at those, has this phrase. This is echoed from the previous chapter, so you may remember me mentioning this. To be brought before God. There's even a little footnote for the text, usually to help explain this, that it meant in that time the judge. The Hebrew word could have been interpreted the same as God's representative, is another way for us to understand it in English, or the judge or the person who was in that local community at that time seemed to be representing God in the place of Moses, so to speak, because we learned from Moses that his father-in-law said, you can't do all this work yourself. You have to appoint some leaders in the community. So that's what it's meaning here is in these different cases, you would take it before God, that is, by means of God's representative in your community, and have these fines assessed to the guilty party. Now, I think it gets really important as we talk beyond the livestock, property issues and into relationship issues. A lot of these laws we touched on even last week had to do with person-to-person, interpersonal relationships and how that affects the community. So while today it's true, in our culture, you can extrapolate from all these, it's certainly the basis for our strong society here in America, personal rights. But the Bible doesn't use that language as much as when people do this, look at how it affects the larger units, the family unit, then the tribe or the larger community of the community of believers, the Israelite people, the family of God. So that's what these verses really have to do with. Let's look at them. Verse 16 and following. When a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if the father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. So this is about virginity, it's about women, it's about premarital sex. And notice in verse 16, one who is not engaged is a phrase here that's very specific to this case. If it were that the young woman was engaged, then this would be treated as adultery. And so that would be a very different punishment. It may seem like the man is getting off a little easy here, but not so in the case. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. Laws around this tend to seem to be about consensual sex outside of marriage. The Torah is very clear about acts of rape or even incest. That should not be done, and those were much more serious cases. But in this case, it seems to be concerned most about the young woman. The concern is for the woman's welfare, her reputation, and her family of origin. It's not to say the man has no culpability. He certainly has to pay the fine. But the issue is, how does the community protect one like this young virgin? How does the community care for women in a society where there are no other safety measures, social safety nets? Men can work and don't really require those sorts of safeguards here. So this is to protect the value of the woman. She, after losing her virginity, may not be as desirable a bride in that case. This would cause harm. Certainly in the short term, but really it's also about creating long-term hardship. If she had to live without a husband, what would become of her with no social safety net like we have in our day and time? So what we can learn from this, I think, the important thing to hold on to is Torah law is concerned for justice. Torah law is often about protecting the most vulnerable people in the community. The man pays the penalty to the family, the father of the young woman, if he will not marry her, or if that family, the woman's family rejects, or the woman herself rejects the man as a potential husband, then still the man has to pay the penalty. So there is justice in that regard. Now, I also want to come to what I think are serious cases of crimes that seem a little bit disjointed here as you read, but certainly are serious because they lead to death. So listen to this section here, starting with verse 18. You shall not permit a female sorcerer to live. One who lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. Wow. Yeah, that's quite a list. Maybe you don't remember this from your childhood Sunday school classes.
What about the male sorcerer?
Right. What about the warlock? Yeah, that's not treated here. Although I think implied here is that magic is not good, and we're going to talk about that. But yeah, what a variety of seemingly disconnected cases, and why the death penalty in these situations. Well, To answer that briefly, just leaning back on the Jewish tradition here, these were crimes against God. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also, I think, just from my own upbringing here in Virginia, a little anecdote might be of help. Had you heard the story about the young man who went to see the old country doctor? And the doctor didn't even prescribe any medicine. He took care of the problem in just one wise statement. So the young man said to the doctor, "I'm having trouble because it really hurts when I put my arm like this." He said, "It hurts when?" "Well, when I put my arm back like this, it really hurts." And the doctor looked at him and said, "Well, don't do that." Right. And that's kind of the point here with these very serious crimes. Don't do those things. That shall not be done among the people of God. It's the breaking of the first commandment, right? Just don't do that. The engagement in magic is to enter into a completely different worldview, contrary to the monotheistic moral belief system that God has been teaching the Israelites. So sorcery was wrong, not just the females, but the males implied. Other ancient law codes had implied that magic was all right. This was something that the pagans would do. The Torah outlaws it entirely. Some of the other ancient law codes would outlaw magic only if it was used for evil purposes. But the Torah says not at all. Why? This opposing worldview or belief system, opposing the faith in one God, presupposes that the world is ruled by supernatural forces, not by God, and that magic would presuppose certain people could harness these supernatural powers and control events or even control other people. Now, you can just draw your own conclusion like the country doctor. Don't do that. That's wrong. It's interesting. Here's a little footnote. It's probably more raising questions than it answers them here, but I found it curious. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is undoubtedly what Jesus used in his day and time, it had become so widespread, the Septuagint chose to translate the word sorceress with using the word poisoner. Now it's interesting because in assassinations, quite often poisoning was the method. And you would wonder, one would want to deduce, but you can't say for sure, I wonder if there were cases in that young community of Israelites after the Exodus of women poisoning people. We don't know, but here it is. And it became such an important law, written down that way. It would seem it goes right along with that commandment to not murder, right? So we can't say much more about this. I find it rather curious, but it is a way of reminding people about that first commandment, to have no other gods and trust in no other power but God. Now, bestiality. We have a word here for this commandment. I would think one word in English suffice. Gross. All right, yeah, just don't do that. Sex with animals. The scriptures indicate that whoever has sex with an animal has broken that first commandment. You've actually lowered yourself to the level of an animal. Blurred the line between what is holy and what is not, being created in the image of God or not. This is not to be done. But these were pagan practices. Something like this has to actually go into the Torah law, because in the prevailing culture around, particularly when they entered into Canaan, these different, pagan rituals, fertility rites in the springtime, had all sorts of sexualized practices along with it. God is different. And do not forget that you're made in the image of God. And so bestiality, this is just not to be practiced. Again, in cases of capital punishment, these ancient laws, some rabbis say it was highly unlikely that the death penalty was actually enforced, certainly not in every case. But the mention of death with these particular cases is to highlight, to accentuate the seriousness of such perverted behavior. So it also was not good for the whole faith community. You wouldn't want to lead others astray into the practices of magic or pagan sex practices or what have you. So it does then seem to flow when you get to the third of these capital punishment type of cases with sacrifices to the other gods. Have no other gods before me in the Ten Commandments, right? The common practices of other pagan peoples really required this boundary to be very clear for God's people. So let me take the statement just a little further. As I've already mentioned, these types of sexualized practices. Well, the pagan rituals had included, although you might be able to make the case that by this time in human history, some of those were getting away from this practice, but it was common to have human sacrifice. People killing another human being in the name of a god as either an annual or some other regular practice during the year at certain times to certain gods, killing a human being. The Torah restricts that. The law of God restricts any sexualized practices, and this was revolutionary in its time, to desexualize God and the worship of God, to desexualize religion in the community, and move people, families, and therefore marriages, toward a more moral and monogamous relationship practice in marriage. So, yes, in the Old Testament, for a certain number of generations, one might think out of necessity in order to bring about more offspring, children, very different from our day and time. Children were, in a sense, the workforce for a family, for a tribe, community. They also were the future. So you all are sitting here, and I am somebody who is still hopeful to enjoy retirement, right? We have been brought up in a culture where we kind of point forward all of our lives to prepare for, plan carefully, save with discipline and consistency to have a secure retirement. Back then, the only 401k was to have 4 or more children. Let's put it that way. I'm just, whatever the number might be, 14 children, something like that. You just have to enter into a different worldview, a different circumstance, a different way of thinking about it. So that a man would have multiple wives or even concubines, however you want to understand all these practices, it was not based simply in sexuality, but in the strength of the family unit, the household, and the broader community. So that was moving away from a God. I think in the Torah and the other parts of the Old Testament, you could see a move away from multiple spouses, certainly wives. You didn't get a case where multiple husbands. Aren't you ladies relieved? But you do see monogamy, even at least in its infancy in the Torah law. So it's moving in that direction and away from the pagan practices. One other point, this may seem a little unrelated, but I want to get into it just brief, at least touch on it just briefly, because we'll get into it further at another time. The Torah is really about behavior, and it does not limit the freedom of somebody's thought life. So, you are not so much punished for thinking about these things, but for doing them. The only exception is, as we talked about, the 10th commandment, coveting, which really is not thinking only. It's about obsessive behavior that starts to lead one to unlawful actions. But the reason I bring it up is, a lot of these things are about behavior modification. By the time we get to the New Testament and to Jesus' teaching, well, Jesus kicks it up a notch, doesn't he? Jesus raises the standards for those who would believe in God through Christ, higher moral standard, such that our heart's intentions matter, and certainly our thoughts. Now, it says somewhere in the New Testament, right? I'm only a Methodist, don't get me to quote chapter and verse. Maybe my Baptist friends will tell me, but bring every thought into captivity in Christ, right? So it does matter. I'm just telling you that was not the focal point of the Torah. The Torah was really about actions, behavior in the community. But thoughts matter to us. And by the way, if I ever figure out how to bring every thought into captivity in Christ, I will let you know, and we'll do a class on that. If you've already got it figured out, come see me. I'd love to get a little bit better at that myself. God's grace being my helper. Hey, I want to move on. This is very important. Can't do every verse. I'm going to try to hit what I think some of the most important sections. Verse 21 and following. You shall not oppress a resident alien. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Very important phrase. Come back to that in a minute. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, will surely hear their cry. 24. God says this, my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children. That's some strong language from our God. Let's talk about this. Just really raises my eyebrows a little bit with its choice of words, but also in its grace and justice. So that might surprise you just as much. Listen. Laws about the stranger, the alien, the resident alien, whatever your translation at home may say, are really important. The Torah goes to great lengths to protect the most vulnerable in the community, the widow, the orphan, the poor, the stranger, or alien. It's amazing to me in its concern for the least among people. In contrast, so you can read some of these other ancient cultures, ancient law codes that we can find, particularly those of ancient Greece, like of Athens and Sparta, state, and I'll quote, the strong do what the strong have the power to do, and the weak accept what the weak must suffer. I mean, that's what? The survival of the fittest? The law of the jungle? That's just the way the world is. But that was the extent of putting that into law in other cultures. Just think about what it meant to be a community of God that could accept a law like I just read. Do not wrong or oppress the stranger. You also were strangers in a strange land, right? And this repeats itself through the Old Testament, different times in Israel's history. It's an amazing consideration for the least among the people. And so I think the Torah distinguishes itself from pagan practices by caring for the least. Even when the person is not part of one's family or household unit, or not even a Hebrew. So we've talked about how these different laws, it may be hard for us to understand them, but when we look at these different laws carefully in the Book of the Covenant here, we find equality. When we realize that the value of an eye, when it speaks eye for an eye, your eye, Dick, is just as important as mine, and so is Sandy's. Sandy's eye is of the same value as yours or mine. It's an amazing thing to think about that. Oh, yeah, God is certainly being inclusive of all the people, even the non-Hebrews among them. That's very considerate, generous. I'll give you a quote from a German Jewish philosopher, Hermann Cohen. He said, and I quote, about this verse, a stranger was to be protected although he was not a member of one's family, clan, or religion, simply because he was a human being. Therefore, in the stranger, man discovers humanity. That's really kind of a powerful statement when you think about what God is revealing in the Torah. Over the years in different interpretations, people discover through the one God of the Bible a kinship with all people. You know, it may have been translated humankind or mankind, however you want to look at this, but there really wasn't that much of a concept of that prior to this. So what we find, again, I know I'm being repetitive, but isn't that part of teaching and learning? In the story of Exodus, in the actions of coming out of slavery and out of this long-term sort of being put down and being, held back without really identity except being Hebrew people, to coming to a full belief and knowledge of the one true God through these 10, the Bible says plagues, but you could understand that word as like strokes or big actions, with kind of a militant ring in their ear, these sort of major actions that God caused to let the people get out of Egypt. They've been set free, but why? In freedom, there's great responsibility, right? So you have the one true God revealing God's self, God's heart, God's way, God's will through his word, through his 10 commands to show people a way to live that is different from all of these other pagan cultures around them, and that this law, this word from God, may be applied universally. It's intended to be for all people. So I think that is so different from all the other ways that society had been arranged prior to this. Let's look a little further. I wanted to say one other thing about that in verse 21 before I skip down to 25. Yeah, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, or you were aliens in the land of Egypt. God continues to remind them of that experience. Why? So it's one thing to set out like a rule book and say, here are the laws, here are the policies. But people are people, right? And we may not think immediately about what are the rules, but maybe more about relationship. Remember your experience and how God related to you. So use that as your guide to relate to others. It's the unique power of the law of empathy. The law of empathy. If I did a poll in here and I asked you real quick, hey, is empathy a synonym for compassion? Many of us would probably think so, but they're related, but they're different. Think about compassion at one level, and empathy kicks it up a notch. What is compassion? The word that we have in English literally means to suffer with. Compassion, passion, suffering. To suffer with or alongside, but so you have a heart for it. You may feel, we say this phrase in churches sometimes, right? I have a burden for that need or for that particular person or that family or that cause. And compassion is a good thing. You feel the burden of the suffering of others. You're moved to take action to help. You can sympathize. But empathy is a bit deeper. Empathy does all of that and some. Empathy means not only do I have that compassion for you, but one step further, I know what it's like. I've been there. I've been there. That's when one cancer survivor can put her arm around another and say, I know what you're going through. I've had it too. I've been there. So that's empathy. When we empathize, we put ourselves literally in somebody else's shoes, or you might be able to say, I have walked in your shoes. God is underscoring empathy in this case. Remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And remember, the function of remembering, that the book of Exodus is literally about remembering rightly who God is and what God has done for God's people. And knowing who God is, we can be assured God will do good for us as well. All right, occupational hazard. I'm a preacher, so I'm probably making a lot out of this. Hey, don't let me forget verse 24 as I kind of used some expression as we read through it. God's using some strong language here. My anger will burn. In another translation, my anger will blaze forth. I haven't found another place where God gets this emphatic here. I'm recalling, not my dad, but I've known some fathers who have used this phrase. Maybe you've used it before. Some dads here in the room. I brought you into this world. I can take you out. It's just that, you know what I mean? God is just that animated about this. Why? Well, when the community did not care for the stranger, God is saying, I will then bring measure for measure retaliation against you. If you don't help the widow and the orphan, watch out. I might make your families into widows and orphans. He's talking to the men, obviously. Watch out. Measure for measure. I don't think this is much about, getting on God's angry side or God trying to flex his muscles. It's another way that the Torah, in an ancient time, no computers, no way to put a newspaper headline on this, trying to hit the highlight button or the underscore and say, this is just so important. It's integral to your identity as God's people, that you might show that you have the heart that God has for others, particularly those who are the most vulnerable. So it's another way of saying, don't miss this. This is so important. I'm going to read verse 25, and I got to tell you a little personal about this. If you lend money to my people, the poor among you, shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. I take this verse very seriously in my ministry, and I have all along. When I give to those in need, or on behalf of my church, I'm giving to people in need. Some of them will actually say to me, oh, I'll pay you back. I'll pay the church back. I'll pay God back. And I am pretty clear. Usually, I try to say this, if I can, in these words. It's a gift, not a loan. It's a gift, God's grace. It's a free gift, so use it wisely. Say things like that maybe, but it's not my expectation to see that money again. But there are times. Happened just over the holidays recently that a man came back to me and said, I've got a gift because my family was hurting last year and you helped with a gift. Here's a gift. And it was double what we had shared with him before. And, his expectation when he said it to me, it's a gift. I hope you can help someone else. So that's the intent, and that's what we do. But there's no interest. Now, this is interesting, this thing about interest, okay? Because those who've always had money, there's always been a way to make more money. And there's nothing wrong with that, except in this case, not when you lend money to my people, says the Lord, to the poor among you, particularly. The Torah, again, gives attention to the poor. And I think it's a signal to be generous among God's people. Otherwise, someone may become impoverished, maybe even to the point of going into that slavery we talked about in the last chapter, which is an indentured servitude to pay back debts. The Torah is actually being very compassionate here in comparison. Let me give you something to contrast with this law. The Roman law, of course, which came some centuries later than this, but still, the Roman law, the 12 tables, allowed you to keep the debtor, the other person, in chains for up to 60 days. Wow. In this case, it's more about lending in such a way that you won't cause them to go further into financial hardship. Christianity certainly has had a long tradition. Slip up a hand if you're familiar with this term, usury. Usury, if you've heard about that. So, I don't hear this talked about as much anymore. And in our day and time, even in the wonderful Commonwealth of Virginia, which used to be a bit more conservative and careful about these things, you might go into a poorer section of town and find storefronts, businesses like loan sharks that are paycheck advance type of companies or car title loan type of companies. Not good. This is one of those where you're like bending somebody's arm back. Don't do that. Don't do that. That hurts. When you think about super high interest rates, even credit cards will charge, people who can't afford it, it seems, will pay 18, 21% interest, something super high interest. Usury, it's not good. Christians certainly are not to practice that way. But here we have laws that have legalized that in our day and time. So I want to mention something else. Forgive me, it may seem a little disjointed, but I'm trying to hit some highlights here. I almost didn't include this, but then I thought about Jesus. Look at verses 26 and 27, talking about someone and their cloak. If you got his cloak, give it back before dark. And I kept rereading that going, and so I had to go look it up. What's the big deal? Give it back before dark. In my day and time, I will tell you, I went to my closet, little confession, went to my closet this morning, and I had a choice of like a half a dozen different, blazers that I could have chosen. Now, don't give me a fashion review whether I chose wisely or unwisely today. But I've got plenty of clothes. So when I think about the word cloak in my mind, it's like everybody's got plenty of clothes. The poor people that I work with, when I've gone overseas to some of the poorest countries in the world, it's not for lack of clothing. But back in the ancient times, the cloak was so valuable. It took a lot of effort to make clothing, period. The cloak, the outer garment, served a number of functions. It was likely one of the most valuable possessions that an ancient person would have had. They used it for a blanket at night, which is why God says, hey, give it back before dark. Also, during the day, they would use it as a pack to wrap things in and to carry things around. And often, the cloak was given as a pledge or collateral for debt. So here again, the Torah shows unique levels of compassion, a focused sense for justice and peacekeeping in the community, give the cloak back. You don't want to hold on to that. So be generous, people. Show grace and compassion to people around you. And I thought about Jesus because, don't you know, the cloak functions in several of the stories. I'll give you a couple of quick ones. I think we got a moment. I'm remembering where Jesus says, if you have two, then give one to someone. When I read it in this context, I realize just what a gift that is to give someone an extra cloak. But more, I'm reminded of the story of blind Bartimaeus. Often beggars in the Bible don't have their name mentioned, but Bartimaeus did. And I think in some reasons he's memorialized because he did this. It says in one of our translations, casting off his cloak, he arose and went to Jesus. For a blind man, to cast aside his cloak meant that he had nothing but full faith and confidence in Christ to supply his need, to answer his prayer, to give him his sight. How else would he go back and reclaim his cloak, right? And it was such a big deal that he did that. It was an act of faith. So think about these laws, as strange as they are, also invitations to consider our own faith and our own acts of compassion and generosity. All right, verse 27, if your neighbor cries out to me, God says, I will listen, for I am compassionate. This is beautiful. There's only one other place in Exodus where God says that phrase. We know, for the way that God has written this word or inspired this word, we know the heart of God. The heart of God is actually not judgment, but compassion. I am compassionate, God says. Spoiler alert. This is when, you'll hear this again, if you're keeping score at home or if you're concerned about it. We do get back on top of the mountain where Moses gets to interact with God up close and personal. And that's where God, again, reveals his heart to Moses. So a little spoiler alert there. But I love this. The theme of compassion, who knew that the law would be so filled with compassion? Compassion needs a just community, a law-abiding community for compassion to be effective. And a compassionate heart often precedes acts of justice and mercy. Sometimes we think of the Old Testament as rough and harsh, but these laws do express the very heart of God and the compassion that we feel as well. Hey, verse 28, you shall not revile God or curse a leader of your people. I wrote in my notes just with a wink and a smile, this is the verse for the worship committee at church, right? Respect God, also respect God's leaders. I mean, I've had people, it's funny. Nobody in this room, don't worry, you all are so nice. But I've had people, we're a United Methodist Church, so we've got so many different kinds of different people from different backgrounds who have certain expectations about worship. And I've had people just red in the face and foaming at the mouth, put that doxology back the way it belongs, or give me doxology 95, enough with that 94 stuff. That's for, anyway. Woo, yeah, think about that. I mean, personal preferences might be the new idols of our age. Do not revile God or curse the leader of your people just because you don't like the music. Lord have mercy. In all seriousness, though, the law works when people have respect for God. Right? I mean, in a secularizing circumstance that we find ourselves in today, you have to understand, there's got to be respect for God. Law and order break down without respect for God or for people. But let's move on. Let me pick on the finance committee for a minute. Verse 29, you shall not delay to make offerings. I'm talking to my own finance, nobody's here from the finance committee. You understand what I mean. From the fullness of your harvest, from the outflow of your presses. Yes, it's interesting because offering to God out of the goods, a lot of agrarian context here, livestock or the fruits of the harvest. But it's always been in the Bible, from the very first family. Cain and Abel, hey, they argued over the offering, right? But that's something we do for the Lord. Now we're into chapter 23, and I have a few minutes. Yes, we can do a few of these verses. I think they're connected here. It's still the book of the covenant, so I want to press on into this section. Next week we'll start a new section. But from the first verse of chapter 23, you shall not spread a false report. This also is part of the Ten Commandments, right? Don't bear false witness. It's more than lying. It is taking a public stand to or spreading a false report like hearsay or gossip. You should not join hands with the wicked and act as a malicious witness. Okay, truth and justice go together. That's something we can understand right here. Be fair is what the Torah continues to tell people in the way that they treat one another. It's quite a few verses right here about being just, acting justly or truthfully, and not taking bribes. You know, this is universal. This is important in every time and place. But again, with an eye to compassion and one thought about Jesus here is verse 4, about your enemy's ox. It's interesting that it uses the word enemy. So I don't know if you're familiar with who your enemies might be, but be kind to their ox. Well, no. Jesus said, love your enemies. And we, rightly so, give Jesus a lot of credit for that. It's not taught in the other major world religions necessarily, or as plainly as this. But certainly Jesus had this verse to go back to, where even in the Torah law, the Old Testament law, there is the idea that a just or righteous person would want to be kind and compassionate even to somebody with whom they've got a beef. About ox, I had to use the word beef. Thank you for paying attention. Okay. Moving on. Yes, I can move on. Verse 9. You shall not oppress the resident. Here again about the stranger, right? You shall not oppress the resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. The repeated laws to protect the stranger and to care for the poor are important. It's another way, the repetition is another way to help people remember and to show the importance, how close this is to the heart of God. You once were this way. I brought you out of that, set you free, so now you shouldn't treat others the way you used to be treated so poorly. Verse 10, I'm going to connect the Sabbath with this kind of compassion theme. Well, the Torah doesn't. For 6 years shall you sow, your land gather its yield. Verse 11, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the poor of your people may eat, and that what they leave, the wild animals may eat. You shall do the same in your vineyard, your olive orchard. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn slave and resident alien may be refreshed. Now, if you're sitting in here for the first time, I just want to remind you that the Hebrew and the Greek languages had no differentiating words. It was only one word for both servant and slave. And so we might do well to, in this case, again, remember it's probably your indentured servant who's there for a time. Not, slavery that's outlawed outright in the Bible, and rightly so, is when you kidnap somebody and force them into bondage, into slavery. And of course, that's what happened in the slave trade for so many years. That was the slavery that our nation dealt with. But this is a different context. What I want you to do, I want you to hear before I do wrap this up and take some questions. Sabbath keeping, because we've already heard about the Sabbath. That was established in the Ten Commandments, but certainly way before then in the book of Genesis, even in the rhythm of God's creative acts in the stories of creation. The Sabbath had already been established, but it's now one of the top 10 laws, right? But in this paragraph, the Torah connects Sabbath keeping with your regular care for the poor in your community, particularly with this 7th year. 7th year, let the land rest. Let the people who are poor benefit more from the land in that year. And you may have been familiar with this phrase, although it's not mentioned here, it's brought out later, the Jubilee year. That in the Jubilee, you forgive the debts that people have had against you in that 7th year. So the 7th day itself, what I noticed was 6 days you work, on the 7th day you rest. That Sabbath also means the people who work for you should take a break. That's preaching to the preacher right there. I gotta make sure I live up to that. The people who work with me at church or what have you. Think about your servants. Think about your livestock. They also should enjoy a ceasing. That's what the word Sabbath literally means. To cease from that regular routine that you're doing, the work that you're doing. Enjoy a Sabbath rest. Verse 13. Be attentive, God is saying. Be attentive to all I've said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods. Do not let them be heard on your lips. The thing about other gods, one last thing. So this is all of the Torah law is trying to prescribe a way to live that leads to justice, peace, and harmony in the community with everyone believing and worshiping the same God. I don't believe our God is threatened by these false gods. What's threatened is this way of life, because each of the pagan religions would have had their own culture, their own way of doing things, their own way of treating, hey, this is good, this is not good, black magic, sorcery, all that kind of thing was acceptable. And so this is a way of being different from. So when God is saying again and again, no other gods, it's no other cultural practice. You shouldn't be compromising this way that God has given you, which is more of a straight and narrow, specific way, with kind of just, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? So again, God repeats in order to help us remember this is the way that God has led the people, set them free so that they might be different from the rest. So there is chapter 22, part of 23. Kind of the themes will change as we get into next week. So any thoughts, questions, comments, wisecracks? Anybody?
I skipped over the part about if the firstborn of your son is, you must give me the firstborn of your sons to do the same with your cattle and sheep. Let them stay with their mothers for 7 days and give them to me on the 8th.
Yeah, what verse number are you on?
That on 22, the last few verses of 22.
Yeah, you've definitely picked up on, one reason I didn't want to touch on. That's a tough one, isn't it?
Maybe you might not want to address it.
Oh my goodness.
I wasn't sure what it meant.
Yes. So the idea of dedicating your firstborn sons. Now, without trying to get into, you've heard me try to give explanation for it in short form without getting into a lot of how the text is probably added to over time as the worship life and the practices of God's people expand over time. You see the books of Moses in this way. The Torah is not always chronological, right? So understand first, I'm looking at, by the way, chapter 22 still. Yeah, chapter 22, verse 29, the second half of that verse, your firstborn sons shall be given to me. This is not about human sacrifice, all right? But later in the development of the Israelite religion, Old Testament religion, there was this call that the firstborn sons would be dedicated to God. You think about the vows like the Nazirite vows. They wouldn't take any alcohol. In the case of Samson, for example, didn't cut his hair. There were different things that went along with this, but they were set aside quite often to become priests. But that would assume a later date when there was actually priestly work to do, particularly in the temple periods. But we're about to get into the use of the tabernacle. We're going to hear more about that, and this could actually be referring to that. So I'm going to try to figure that out with a little more detail for you. But I wanted to at least answer the question in saying this is certainly not what was practiced at times among the pagans, where you actually would literally have to give a human sacrifice of a young baby. Thanks for letting me steal your... Can you steal the Bible? I'm not sure it's possible. Other comments or questions, anybody? Thank you for these questions. I mean, it helps me to think a little more. Yeah.
A comment I had heard in relation to giving the firstborn was at that time, the religious leaders furnished education. They also furnished any health care that was fit into that area. And they did a lot of teaching. And so it was a bigger organization than what we see in most places today.
Yeah, Dick is bringing up a really good point. And as the society, over some centuries, you could think of it developing where those who went into, it ended up being the tribe of Levi. The Levites became the priests. But in this case, when you dedicate a child to the Lord, particularly be a son, firstborn son, generally, that was really the only opportunity for education, higher learning. You know, a lot of it was an oral education. You told these stories, but it's not likely that anyone in the family would have a copy of the Torah. You know, it took a long time before it got written down, right? But they would be taught. And so you would have at least one of your children who was educated. Yeah. And in a mostly illiterate society, that was a big deal. And it created a place for them then, particularly if they became priests or later on rabbis. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, comments? This may not be the most exciting part of Exodus. I'm just letting you know, particularly if you're new. We do get back on the mountain. It will be, some more smoke and thunder and lightning to come. But more importantly, without any teasing, Exodus continues to provide really, for me, it's just sort of the imaginative sense of being there on the mountain. Instead of saying it, I'll ask you as a closing question. What does the phrase, the presence of God, mean to you? The presence of God. Because what we find revealed in the Exodus story from start to finish, so whether it be the way that Moses and God took on the powers of Pharaoh in the enchanted land of Egypt, or out at Mount Sinai in this wilderness place, high on a rocky mountain, really without, it's not the mountains of Virginia. There's no beautiful green vegetation around. It's a real desolate place. What does it mean to be in the presence of God? I think it's just a powerful and maybe a prayerful invitation to consider as we finish the book of Exodus over these next weeks. So more action to come. Next week, a little bit more law. All right, go in peace. Behave. Follow the laws.